Okay, good to see you, Dorian. So, we have the title Mozart the Performer, and as you point out early in the book, Mozart was hardly the only composer who was also, a top flight performer, and specifically in Mozart's time, as you write, virtually all composers were performers. So, given that concession, what what is special in particular about what you're arguing for in the case of Mozart?
I think I'd start, first of all, hi everybody, and thank you so much, Dean and Jessica and Mark. Yeah, I think I'd start actually by saying that it may be that there isn't that much that's special about Mozart in this particular respect. As I say in the book, and as you point out, virtually all composers were performers at the time. Many performers were also composers. And it's very possible that the kind of study I undertake in the book could be done in the context of any number of these figures. I think that the motivation along these lines is partly that even though it's a commonplace that there was such interplay between composition and performance at the time, we all know this is true of Mozart and of all these contemporaries, but the implications of that alignment, I think, haven't been fully understood. And again, that might be also true of figures like, for example, Veracini or Beethoven and any number of other people we might name. One thing that's special about Mozart in this regard might be that we know his compositions better than we know many compositions of other contemporary composer performers, and that means that our view of them might be more radically shifted by thinking of him as a performer and asking what this actually means for his compositions. And again, I think that broadly that's a question that hasn't really been fully addressed or understood. It's easy to say that he was a performer and acknowledge this, but I think it's
Sure.
something different to actually ask what this really means for how he was working, and more importantly, maybe what we should make of his music.
Yeah, indeed. Maybe if we're trying to be more particular, part of the answer might lie in your subtitle, where we have the word showman. Um, and that kind of intuitively feels like that could be something that's reasonably more particular to Mozart.
It
So
could be, yeah. I
what do you
mean,
think?
it's very true. It could be. It partly depends on what you mean by showman, because certainly it's also true that many other performers at the time were trying to show off a lot. And again, Mozart might be unique, as you're hinting, in the way he was showing off. There might be something about his compositional voice that is also showing off, and that's an idea that I didn't come up with. Uh, and it's been present in various writings on Mozart for the last few decades, but that's something that might be unique to him. That when we think of other performer composers, we often think of them showing off as a means of, or as a way of highlighting their abilities as, say, a virtuoso pianist or violinist. Uh, in the way of physical pyrotechnics, whereas Mozart seems to be doing this also in the fabric of his compositions as part of his compositional persona. That there's a flaunting of inventive riches and the ability to turn somewhat mundane figures into melodic or harmonic or contrapuntal riches that we find him exploring as a composer, in addition to his role as a performer.
Yeah, great. So just to say to everyone, we're aiming to work through the book. The initial aim, anyway, is to work chronologically through by chapters. The first main chapter is called Mozart the Performer, so we're already on to that. So one way into that would be to say maybe the nearest we get to Mozart the Performer are his keyboard variations. Um, and we assume they bear some relationship to ones that he actually improvised. Um, and you point out that a lot of them survive in multiple drafts, with various kinds of ideas. Um, so, so what do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is an idea that has been present in the literature on the variations for a while, that they do seem to embody aspects of his performance life in a way that some of his more polished or finished compositions don't always. So for one thing, many of them originated, as far as we can tell, many of them did in fact originate in actual improvised performances, and then he would later on write down what he had improvised. And the fact that many of them exist in various conflicting drafts also gives them some air of not being reducible to one perfect text, and so they feel a bit like a compositional performance in a way. But more pervasively, the significance of the variations might be in the way, and this is an idea that Roman Ivanovich has given us, that there's something about the way Mozart is looking at themes as being full of potential, full of the possibility of being messed with and played around with, that definitely pervades his compositional language. So the variations, given that he was improvising them, that they show off his pianistic abilities. I should also mention
Yeah.
that they're much more pianistically demanding and interesting, texturally, technically, than his finished sonatas often, which were generally written for students perhaps, or broad publication, whereas the variations, as I say, he's improvising them. So I think we see more of his persona both as a pianist and as a composer in the variation sets. And that's not something that we would necessarily say of the finished sonatas. It's true of some of the concertos, but again, there's not a single corpus that embodies all this to the extent of the variation sets.
Yeah, agreed. And yet it's interesting that the keyboard variations, in terms of scholarly coverage, are actually remarkably neglected. I mean, if you think of all Mozart's solo keyboard writing, the sonatas pretty much fill the screen in terms of corpus studies and just general musicological treatments. So maybe that's indicative that you've hit upon something that we really kind of haven't dealt with, because I completely agree. I mean, if you look at the kind of keyboard writing in terms of inventiveness and range, it's
Absolutely.
so enormous, and yet it's kind of like so often that the invitation to explore has not been taken up. And I think that also
Yeah.
applies to performance as well as scholarly.
Yes, that's what I was about to say. The same is true. There are a number of complete sets of Mozart piano sonatas played on either modern or period instruments. There are very few complete recordings of the variation sets. Some do exist, but in general, performers also neglect them. Yeah. And I think for what it's worth, I would also say that the variation sets have the potential, and this is not something I had time to get into too much in the book, although I talk about it a little bit. The variation sets also have the potential to change how we think about other aspects of Mozart's improvisatory practices. For example, there's a huge number of variation sets that have written out cadenzas. And again, unlike the cadenzas for the piano concertos, which were generally written for students, the variation cadenzas don't look like the piano concerto cadenzas. And this, in studies of Mozart's cadenzas, the fact that we have a whole corpus of other cadenzas of his hasn't seemed to feature in the literature yet. So there's still more potential for understanding other aspects of Mozart's life as a performer through the variation sets than has been realized.
Sure. So we've now introduced one of your key terms, which is performance and performativity. And another key term is modularity or modular composition. So I'm just going to read out something you write in this first chapter, Mozart the Performer. In the late 18th century, musical creativity involved not the production of new, never before heard melodies or harmonic patterns, but the ingenuity with which standard tropes could be assimilated and recycled. Composers fashioned all their music from a common currency of modular building blocks. So modularity as such has probably only come upon us in the last generation or so. Obviously, topic theory is premised on a form of understanding music as modular. Obviously, schemata as well. Anyway, do you want to expand on on that wonderful quotation.
Yes, I mean, as you say, modularity has come into focus recently as a way of understanding not only Mozart's music, but music of this era. One thing that I hope, or that I think is a contribution that this section of the book makes, is that it puts topics into this broader category of modules. Of course, topics are modular, but that's not something that has been highlighted in itself in the literature that taught that the banner of modularity encompasses not only schemata and partimenti and all the familiar sort of note-based modules, but also expressive features like topics. And one of the ideas in that synthesis is that one of the themes throughout the book is that Mozart is constantly playing with expectations of what will come next. And uh, modularity plays a part in this because any way of chunking the musical language, of separating it into bits, it's a way of highlighting the question of what will be next at any given moment. When one module comes to an end, whatever kind of module it might be, we're then starting to ask, well, what kind of module will follow this? And so to include topics in this is a way of trying to start to figure out what kind of jokes Mozart might be playing as a user of topics, just as much as we might ask what kind of jokes he's playing as a user of fontes, which is the module the schema that I select in the book. Of course, we could apply the same questions across his output, but that's the idea of the section that you just read, that it's a way of preparing questions about expectation, humor, surprise, and then later on subjectivity and persona in the operas. And I find the concept of modularity a useful way to synthesize all these disparate ideas, including the expressive features like topics.
Yeah, you do point out at pretty much the same time in the book. You say all music makes use of modules, and I just think it's important because it's clearly an important fundamental concept, but there are also some limitations to it. And it's become very, very highly focused on later 18th century repertoire. And so that implies composers are using more familiar material more of the time in particular set ways. And then I always kind of think, what about the art music that came before, which we generally term Baroque? Is that not equally modular, if not more so?
Oh, absolutely is. And again,
But then the point is,
yeah.
why is that not a kind of scholarly theme? That's kind of what I'm interested in.
Well, it is. I mean, the Musica Poetica tradition that finds rhetorical figures in Baroque music is another, that's another equally valid kind of module. I think one thing that is different about earlier music and then Mozart's music or music of Mozart's time is the rate at which expressive modules are changing, or not across time, but within individual pieces of music. It's not unusual to find Bach or Handel sitting in one sort of expressive mode for an entire aria. It's something that Mozart doesn't do. Mozart seems to want to highlight the juxtaposition of unlike topical states, for instance, or expressive states. And that's something that means that the use of modules is itself a sort of aesthetic feature of the music that if we want to focus on, we can draw our ears towards and understand as saying something in itself. So I think the modules are drawing attention to themselves in this later music, maybe in a way that
Yeah.
they're not always in earlier music. Again, it's not true across the boards. There's plenty of music by Bach or his especially German contemporaries that use other kinds of modules in close succession. But there's definitely an expressive shift in sort of the level of modularity that we're listening for. And by Mozart's time, it becomes much more expressive. It's easy to listen to Mozart without really tracking the change between, say, a Romanesca and a Printer. I find it difficult to listen to Mozart without being aware of these quicksilver changes of expressive affect.
Sure. And obviously there's a massive change in phrase syntax, which
Indeed.
over the 18th century, which helps to explain exactly that point. So it's fundamental to the argument in your book. I also have reservations about that, and one difficulty, and it applies to all recent theoretical approaches. I'd also include sonata theory, is that all of these kind of collude with the image of later 18th century music as being unimaginative and conventional. Now, obviously, we rescue Mozart from those associations, but as a sort of general point, it's like presumably composers thought they were being original in some way or other at this time. But you'd agree, right, that we do have this kind of image of a highly conventional, but also unimaginative and impersonal music. And so one difficulty with all of these kinds of approaches is they sort of give it a new lease of life. And also they're not asking other questions, which you do, in fact, in this chapter. At the end of this chapter, and you say modular explanation leaves untouched questions of pacing, rhetoric, expressive coherence, and yeah, for me, above all, it's about pacing. So rhythm
Yes.
in a large scale sense, so that all of these approaches have been incredibly useful, but they have their blind spots, and the blind spots are often not acknowledged in a way that I
Absolutely.
think you have in the book. Um,
Yeah, I try, but I would just briefly put in a plug for modularity, even as a productive and positive way of listening to some of the more conventional music. I think that an awareness of the building blocks actually, in some sense, it's true. There's some music that ends up looking very conventional and somewhat boring, but the awareness of the building blocks is, I think, in some sense, a prerequisite for also finding this music to be interesting and creative. The more you know the building blocks, the more you appreciate departures from them. And I think there are many passages, not only in Mozart, but in music by his contemporaries that, 20 years ago, uh, 30 years ago might have looked somewhat mundane that now look extremely cool and interesting
yeah,
because they depart in provocative ways from some sort of schema that just it wasn't being thought so widely about by theorists 30 or 40 years ago. So I think that it's true. Some composers don't look great when you are doing schematic analyses of their music, but in many cases, I actually think that an awareness of the convention makes those composers' contributions look better, actually. And certainly I appreciate Mozart and many of his contemporaries much more than I did before I had gotten into schemata. So I don't know.
yeah.
I
So
think you're right, but also
yeah.
there's a
So
positive side
yeah.
too.
What
Yeah,
seems
but
routine actually can have a specific identity because we can say, that's this basic underlying pattern, and then
yeah,
the
and especially
course is
exactly.
exactly in how it's realized.
Exactly. And
Um,
in the case of Mozart, especially, there are places where he'll stack two modules, for example, and it's easy to look at these passages and not even notice that they're modules. I'm thinking, for example, of the opening, if people have it off the top of their heads, the opening of the E flat Piano Sonata K.282, which starts with a pretty standard Romanesca, and then he stacks a Printer and a Fonte at the same time. And something like that, it's a sort of passage that we might not have looked at all or cared about really. Uh, in theoretical circles 30, 40 years ago. But now once you see it as a stacking of these two modules, it becomes incredibly inventive, almost compositionally virtuosic in Mozart's ability to take two things that look like they shouldn't be stackable or that seem to have nothing to do with each other. One of them modulates, one of them reinforces the tonic, and find a way to superimpose them. Uh, for instance, and we can extend that also to other kinds of modules. The same passage is a complete descending rule of the octave, which itself might not look like it's compatible with both a Printer and a Fonte superimposed on each other. He makes it all work. And that's something, as I say, it might not have looked that impressive as a little three bar passage some time ago, but now it looks really impressive. And that's not the only piece where one can say this.
yeah.
Yeah.
One big thing in favor of the modular view, I think, is that it fits with this dominant metaphor for how music was understood at the time, which is music as language. Um, and so, of course, what is music? What are the implications of saying music as a language? Well, it means that you're working with, well, familiar sounds, right?
Yes.
Familiar, meaningful sounds that everybody can understand that already exist, right? The words already exist, and the interest is the particular concatenation. It's the particular way that you use them and the particular way you get from one thing to another.
Yeah, and I think actually that's a wonderful point you bring up about music as language. I think something I would add to this is that indeed modularity of some sort is a prerequisite for complex language at all. If we're just dealing with onomatopoeias or in music, very basics of word painting, we don't get the possibility of these complicated either tonal or formal systems that seem to generate meaning that isn't just reducible to a set of vibrations. And that's something that's certainly true of language. If language were if words simply tried to imitate sounds of things rather than are having phonemes that are completely semantically neutral but get combined into semantically coherent little chunks, we would be very limited in our expressive abilities. And the same is certainly true of music. So the metaphor is a good one, and it goes quite deep.
Absolutely. So there was something on modularity, on the strengths of it, but also, potential blind spots and certainly if you think about, say, Erdingen's schema theory, he's kind of militantly against, the long range view. And of course, you can say in general, all of these approaches are a big reaction to a perceived time when it was all about organic wholes, right? And we didn't have any sense of particularity about individual gestures. So let's move on to second chapter called Mozart, the pianist. And modularity comes back in another way, where we have collections of what you call pianistic modules. And you collect similar pianistic gestures that are often associated with particular keys. And some very cool examples where you've found like a whole lot of bits of figuration in C major that have remarkably similar contours. So how did you do the corpus study? How do you retain all these things? How can you remember that, you know, that other piece you looked at 3 months ago has the same.
I can't. I mean, I don't have a great answer to this. I spent a lot of time at the piano, and a lot of time just trying to make notes and keep track of things. And I tried to memorize as much as I could. And beyond that, I mean, I think I think the explanation is ultimately just if one is sufficiently obsessed with some corpus of artwork, one will find stuff. And definitely, this is not something that I went into. Writing about Mozart expecting to find. I didn't go in thinking that I would find these weirdly similar G minor arpeggios that only happen in G minor in his piano output, or this, that descending figure in C major. And I really didn't expect to find specific thematic overlaps. There's one, maybe my favorite, that I mentioned in that chapter is the one where we find in his unfinished sonata fragment that is now labeled K400, we find a passage that, in terms of the physical, technical motions, is almost identical to a passage in the 20th Piano Concerto. I didn't expect to find those things. At the same time, I think there also is an acknowledgement that Mozart's piano writing was highly consistent. There's a wonderful anecdote from Charles Rosen where he talks about accidentally wandering from one B flat major concerto to another B flat major concerto by Mozart, and sort of, he sort of sniffs and says, "Well, Mozart has a typical B flat major virtuosity," and people have tried to do some cross-referencing of the pianistic gestures. I try to make it a little bit more abstract in the gestures that I choose than has been done in the literature. So I think of, for example, I start out with a very simple example of just the physical motion of crossing one's index finger over the thumb as a sort of physical pianistic module that can be found in any key. It doesn't require a particular relationship with keyboard topography. It can work in sharp or flat, or in sharp or flat keys, or C major. And then moving from that into examples that we would put in different kinds of pianistic categories, textural licks, or trill gestures, turn gestures. Yeah, my answer, as I say, is simply that I went through the piano music a lot and spent a lot of time playing it and trying to keep track of what he does.
Yeah, it gives us a nice, fresh perspective on key characteristics,
Yes.
right? Which is much, much, much written about. And there's certain literature that gets referred to a great deal. But often it really just amounts to throwing a few adjectives at a key, which is pretty sort of meaningless. And what you're suggesting is we've almost got like sort of digital key characteristics, that they arise out of how it feels physically. In other words, that there are sort of practical physical explanations for why keys can have certain characteristics. And of course, what you're dealing with Mozart might be what we'd call idiolect. But
Yes.
there are also practical things like, E flat major has certain implications. A symphony in C major has certain implications for scoring, which can, carry through into any piece in C major. But I just like that idea that that the origins are in something that he felt. It's just a learnt contour, a learnt, physical behavior at the keyboard.
Yes, absolutely. I still think it's important to remember alongside this that it's true there's a sense of key characteristics. The G minor arpeggio thing, the 20th Piano Concerto, and the K400 fragment. These are very effectively similar in affect and character. But there are also a number of cases where these pianistic licks are quite neutral in affect, and that's something to think about. And the same goes broadly for, you mentioned C major as having a particular kind of orchestral affordances, but he can still write, for example, in the slow movement of the Linz Symphony with trumpets in a slow movement, something he rarely does. And the fact that it's an F major doesn't stop him. And likewise, taking the C major figure you mentioned from the pianist chapter, you find examples that I give that are both in slow lyrical context and also virtuosic fast movements, first movements in three as well as last movements in two. So in some sense, there are key characteristics. In another sense, the affordances are still a bit more flexible than what we find in most literature on key characteristics.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And something that comes up in this chapter as well is just taking us back to ground we covered a little bit earlier with regard to chapter one. That if we're thinking about how Mozart improvised, the difficulty was not coming up with the modules. The difficulty was what you described as protocols that operate at higher levels of structure.
Indeed,
Right.
yeah.
So,
I mean,
so
one
you
of
know
the
that was the difficulty. It
yes.
wasn't saying, okay, I'm going to use this little shape, which I'm familiar with.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I find interesting about this chapter is that it's both interesting in some sense and also not at all interesting in another sense, in that, you can look at all these pianistic gestures that are so similar throughout his output and think it's very cool that clearly he's thinking like a keyboardist, and this is interesting. And on the other hand, as you hinted a few minutes ago, uh, these modules say very little about his longer range planning and the expressive stories he's telling at a more protracted level. And so in some sense, I think it's precisely the insufficiency of these pianistic gestures as a real explanation for what he's up to as an artist that prompts questions about the drama and the surprise, expectation, all the things that I get to later in the book.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So you are trying to deal with what I described earlier as that blind spot.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
That blind spot. Um, and the next chapter, Mozart the Improviser, we've already covered that a little bit. And you mentioned the thematic cross-referencing that arises naturally through the principle of variation, and variation obviously is another one of your um, key key concepts. And it just sort of struck me reading that um, you're trying to account for something which used to be big and is no longer, which is what we'd call unity or thematic unity. That you're trying to bring that back into play, right?
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, I like it. Like it's something that, again, as a listener, I like doing the cross-referencing. I find it fun when I was a student. It's not something that any of my professors foisted on me, but it's just something I was naturally doing a lot. I really enjoyed tracing little thematic transformations across pieces. One of the examples I cite is Rosen on the Ninth Piano Concerto K271, where all the major themes can be seen as variations of that first piano entrance. And I love things like that. Like they just appeal to me. I guess this is the same part of me that likes doing the pianistic cross-referencing. I enjoy this sort of thing. And I do find it interesting. And I find it again, it ties into the performativity because it's something like a playful game. It's something that Mozart can be doing with himself that is either a private game or perhaps in some cases meant to be noticed and appreciated by the listeners, but it's something that that captures this sort of performative outlook, the playfulness and wit that he's pursuing.
Yeah, yeah. So what we're calling unity, I think you could argue, is just becomes a practical consideration for composers in a way that it wasn't at the start of the 18th century. Because if you're going to have a modular style, which by definition can be made up of highly disparate materials, then it's a really obvious creative question: is how do I make the thing run along coherently?
Yeah,
Uh, and so, unity is one way of
exactly.
trying to cover that. So um, I think it becomes what I'd call a live issue for this music in a way that it's kind of not for, say, J.S. Bach, because individual movements are going to cohere because of the very way that he goes about it. So it's not really a kind of live issue in the way that it has to be. It has to be for Mozart.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah.
Every few bars you're going to have different dynamic levels, different textures, just different material altogether. Um, so one big theme in this chapter is the composer getting it wrong, what you call playing dumb. So maybe you could just explain what you mean by that.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite portions of the book. There was a huge premium placed on improvisation in the 18th century. Audiences wanted to witness it. There was enormous market pressure for musicians to be good at it, and it was a huge part of Mozart's personal branding as a performer. But improvisation raises an aesthetic challenge, which is that there's no intrinsic feature of it. There's no way to distinguish it from music that has been written down and memorized in advance. And this is something that people did constantly back then. And Mozart himself participated in this. He wrote out cadenzas, for example, as we talked about earlier. He wrote cadenzas that people would memorize and pass off as improvisations. He wrote a modulating prelude for his sister at one point. There's a wonderful letter where Leopold recounts to Mozart that he came home one afternoon, found Nannerl improvising, couldn't imagine how she had learned to improvise like this, and then she shows Leopold the manuscript leaf that Mozart had sent with a modulating prelude written out. And all of this raises a challenge for somebody like Mozart, whose brand is built on improvising. And the challenge is that he has to show the audiences that he really is in fact improvising. And one way to do this is to take themes from the audience and improvise on them. So somebody shouts out in that famous Prague concert, improvise something from Figaro, and Mozart improvises. But another way to show people that you're improvising in some sense is to pretend that you are failing at it. That this is one of the things that distinguishes improvisation from written composition, is that it can go wrong. So to play with the idea that it can go wrong, highlight missteps in the composition and then try to correct them. This is a way that Mozart can craft music that seems to be inventing itself as it unfolds. So this is something that perhaps he arrives at as a performative trick for his pianistic improvisations, and then he very quickly brings into his written compositions as ways of generating instability and unrest and interest, and making it feel like the music is in fact finding its way at every possible moment, rather than just following some pre-charted course or having been corrected before performance.
Yeah. And one crucial point that you arrive at in this chapter, and it issues from what you've just been saying, is you make the point that Mozart's compositional voice is itself a kind of performative persona.
Yes.
Right? So, in other words, when you're branding the book as being about performance, it's that as well, and that seems to me particularly important to try and do, because we now have a lot of, I guess, what you'd call reparative history, where there's this attitude out there that we've spent generations writing about composers, and what about the performers, right? And so obviously that's given rise to an awful lot of musicological industry. In other words, it's not
Absolutely.
not just the composer, and so that's been a real current preoccupation, and you're actually sort of bridging the two things.
Yeah, this is part of what I started out by saying, that it's easy to say, well, yes, Mozart, like everybody else, was a performer, but to actually ask what this really means for him as a composer, this is, I think, where that comes together in the book. The first two chapters are just preamble in a sense, and it's this chapter on improvisation where the compositional voice really becomes a sort of performative agent.
Yeah, and it actually gives a sense of great spontaneity as well, right? Which I think is one of the things we value in his music.
Yeah.
Um, Mozart the Decorator is the next chapter, um, and that's about how Mozart writes and creates embellishments. And you have some interesting thoughts early on about the status of so-called model embellishments. In other words, where so for instance, for the slow movement of K451,
Yes,
you
Mozart
know,
wrote a
where he,
six-bar
yeah,
little
yeah,
manuscript insertion for Nennerl to show how it
yeah,
might be decorated. Yeah, virtually all the studies of Mozart's embellishments prior to this one, which incidentally, this chapter comes from an article published in 18th Century Music, which Dean uh, greatly improved in the process of editing it. That virtually all studies of Mozart embellishment prior to that um, really focus on these written models. Some of them come from manuscript leaves that Mozart wrote, say, for Nannerl or for von Trattner, his student working on K457. And some of them come from publications when Mozart prepared first editions, for example, of the D major sonata K284 and K332. But one of my arguments is that, in fact, those models tell us much less about Mozart's practices than people have wanted to think. First of all, the models are often very short. They apply to slow movements exclusively. They don't always demonstrate how embellishments will be woven into a movement at a longer range than just in one theme. So, for example, the K451 fragment, as I say, it's 6 bars. It tells us nothing about how the main theme would be embellished when it returns. And I propose that rather than looking at the models, I should also say there are some operatic models, which say more, I think, than the instrumental models. But rather than looking at the models, my idea is that how Mozart varies his themes throughout his output is actually a much better indication of his proclivities as a varier of melodies than any of the explicit models he wrote. And so what I undertake in this chapter is actually a much more exhaustive corpus study than in the piano chapter. I went through everything Mozart wrote and tried to find any instance, both of primary themes or just minor themes throughout his works, where anything is changed. A slur is added or removed, something is simplified, more extensive divisions are added, whatever the change might be. And that I think gives a better picture of, as I said, of Mozart's proclivities as a changer of melodies than the models. And it also, as from the performer's perspective today, it also gives it's a closer model of what the performer today has to do when embellishing Mozart, right? Performers today embellishing Mozart are faced with the challenge of taking a melody that exists and changing it. And so to ask how Mozart did that, how Mozart took melodies that already existed from earlier in a movement and then changes them is a way of I think solving both a scholarly issue and a performative one at the same time, looking at his proclivities, as I say, as an alterer of themes.
yeah, yeah. And you make the nice point that a lot of Mozart's embellishments are circuitous. In other words, they're not predictable. They sort of have these changes of direction. So they're kind of mini examples of the kind of spontaneity, that we were talking about earlier again.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um,
Yeah, and very important also is not only that they're circuitous, but that they're rhythmically quite measured. He doesn't do what Corelli and Tartini and the Italians do at this time and just write these huge sweeping scales with all kinds of irrational divisions of the beat. He sticks with 16th notes or with triplets. He'll stick with one kind of rhythmic value. And I think that's hugely important for this sense of gameplay because when you're
yeah,
sticking with one rhythmic value, arriving at the destination note at the right time is much harder. If you don't mind mixing quintuplets and 16th notes, then it's really easy to alter a melody and arrive at the next note you need to be on at the correct beat. But if you're sticking with just 16th notes or just triplets, it's quite difficult to do that. And so Mozart, by adopting the style, is raising the private improvisatory stakes for himself. He's making it harder for himself in a way that is quite playful and fun.
And that's also when we were having a little chat last week, we compared that with what Mozart's technique in retransitions, right? Where
Yes,
he'll throw
exactly.
all sorts of complications and details in the way, but somehow always arrives back, back at the theme, bang on time.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. This is an observation from Leonard Meyer that Mozart will set up some pattern that can get us to one at the end of a retransition, and he'll deviate from the pattern, and yet he'll still arrive at one just when he would have had he not deviated.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's an exact analog. I mentioned this in both the third and fourth chapters.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And there's just for those who've had access to the book, there's a wonderful table in this chapter just showing a sequence of decorated upbeats in the slow movement of the E flat Violin Sonata K.481, which makes these points very very well, very concisely. Um, Something else that emerges from this chapter, which wasn't so apparent early on, is yeah. So you say to hear the thrust of a piece as arising through the use of embellishments is to hear restlessness, and so this is where towards the end of the book you're starting to you know give us a sort of bigger picture. Um, so what is this? What is this restlessness?
Well, it works on a number of levels, but most basically, it's this sort of maniacal boredom that it's very easy to hear in Mozart once you adopt this mindset that he can't repeat himself. And again, I'm as with many of the things in the book, I'm not the first person to notice this. This is an idea that I think I probably got from Robert Levin. That Mozart just can't stand to repeat himself, and that things always have to be changing. It's one thing to think of that as a performative thing he's doing, but once you start to hear his compositions as embodying this kind of restlessness, they all start to seem like they unfold moment by moment, like they're unpredictable. You hear melodies not just as these glassy, perfect creations that are untouchable, but as things that are themselves being invented on the fly, perhaps. And this is something I think, even though embellishment may seem a very, in some sense, quite a narrow topic. Actually, because Mozart varies melodies so pervasively across his output, this one mental shift is enough to completely change how we hear the music and how restless and inventive it actually ends up seeming.
Yeah, and indeed, of course, to write in a modular fashion is by definition to be varying something which pre-exists.
Yes,
There's no
indeed.
such thing as an ur schema, as we know, because they're mental constructs. But nevertheless, that's kind of intrinsic to the basic idea. Actually, yeah, we should move on. So big final chapter, Mozart, the dramatist. And that actually the restlessness comes up again there too. You say to focus on embellishment in Mozart is to experience his aesthetic as one of restlessness and clutter, which is a nice way of capturing it too. Um, but you also move on to some big questions about subjectivity and character. And this is where you start bringing in operatic works as well, um, and compositional persona. So, what could character mean with reference to music at this time?
Well, it can mean many things. I mean, we've been talking about it in some sense because it can just apply to the expressive scope of some passage, right? It can apply to instrumental music and affect. Um, one of the ideas in this chapter is that if we're going to hear Mozart as being surprising, as being restless, especially the idea of surprise depends in some sense on the idea that we're listening to the music from a sustained vantage point. Something is only surprising uh, if you see all the modules as just doing their own things and the face of the music is constantly changing, nothing is surprising. It's just one thing after another. But to say that we're surprised by the move from one module to the next implies that we're observing these modular changes from some kind of sustained vantage point. And I guess I'm thinking of character in that sense. It's extremely anachronistic. 18th century writings on character, whenever the word comes up in the 18th century, it's essentially used to refer, for example, to typeface, to the actual like literal metal characters that would make up printed words. Only in some neoclassical circles were people drawing on Aristotle and thinking of character as a kind of ethos, as a way of people would interact. My use of character is entirely anachronistic, but it's coming at it from that angle. This idea that we depend on some kind of sustained vantage point if we're going to track these surprises throughout the music, and that gets us very easily into the world of operatic characters who themselves embody these kinds of uh, sustained viewpoints across large amounts of highly varied music, different arias, different ensembles, and yet
Yeah.
seem to have this coherent core of some kind of subjective self.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'd agree that it's completely anachronistic because a lot of the certainly earlier reception of what's basically a sort of Italianate mixed Italianate style is one of the criticisms was this music has no character, right? Because it's constantly shifting from one thing to another. So even if the word itself wasn't used, I think it's that's a kind of premise,
Yeah, sorry,
right?
I should say that the
Um, you know
the
what I mean?
character.
And
Yeah.
that was a big criticism. It's like, what am I to make of this music? 1 minute, 1 minute it's this, next minute it's that. I don't know, I don't know what's going on. So that was built on the idea of some kind of stable expression of temperament, character, mood.
Yeah, that goes into the Aristotelian category. I just meant that in terms of actual fictional characters, we
Yeah,
weren't
yeah,
seeing
yeah,
this
yeah,
word used to
yeah.
describe Susanna. Saying Susanna is a character in Figaro, people would not have used the word that way.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. It's just for me, character, just like I was suggesting for Unity, character becomes an issue precisely at this time because there is this big question: how do we understand this music as coherent in spite of its variable, fragmentary, and indeed modular surface? So, it was being struggled with in reception. Um, so there's that sense of character, but then there's also just sliding into persona. And one of your major points near the end is that the performative compositional persona is foregrounded more deliberately, you say, in Mozart's music than we might find elsewhere.
I think so. I mean, it's a hunch. I can't prove that it's absent from other repertoires, but I have a sense that Mozart is doing it in a way that other composers aren't. This bears on his operatic writing, where he is often trying to show us not only some core self in a character, but an interaction of viewpoints among the characters, that the characters listen to each other musically, in a way that we don't always find in contemporaneous operas. Maybe some of it involves the kinds of tricks he's playing in his symphonies and large-scale serenades that I tackle in that chapter. I see character and persona as meeting up in the sense that often Mozart is, he's not only constructing a compositional persona in individual modules, he's doing it across a movement or across a symphony. And so there's a sense, and especially if that compositional persona is undergoing various dramatic tests, is continuing to play dumb and fail at things, and then have to recover. That there's a sort of sense not only of a performer, but of somebody who is playing, like, very much playing a role, playing the buffoon or playing the clown.
Mm,
And Mozart does seem to be thinking about this. He owned a Harlequin costume. He owned a clown suit, essentially,
mm,
and so he's like, we know that this is a role that he in fact enjoyed playing at dance parties in real life, for instance.
mm,
Yes, and that's something, I can't say for sure that other composers are not doing character in quite the same way, but I think Mozart is doing it in an extremely deliberate and self-conscious way, especially in his operas, when he actually is showing the mechanics of characters listening to each other, taking each other's ideas
mm.
and viewpoints in. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, well, for me, I think I hear a very strong compositional voice, and as long as we don't elide that with this idea that we're hearing the real person, which of course tends to be, the default assumption when we get to a later generation of art music, because I'm not sure if that's really the point, right? There's a kind
Of
of
course.
it's a kind of subjectivity, but it's not in the sense that people like to use it, say, with relationship to Schubert or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah, that's very important. I mean, I mentioned the clown suit only as corroborating evidence, not that that
Yeah, 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 yeah,
actually
yeah. Well, no,
gives
no.
rise to this
By
idea about Mozart.
definition, by
But
definition, if you're
but
putting
yes.
on, if you're putting on a clown suit, right? That's
Yeah.
that's that's a kind of it's an extra layer. It's like, a protective layer or something like that.
Yeah, but
Uh,
absolutely, to be clear, that the compositional persona is not Mozart himself. It's some
yeah,
it's the fictional role he steps into when he sits down to write or sits at the piano.
yep, 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 yep.
And in some sense, that's the subject of the book.
Okay, I think that would be a good punctual place for us to uh, stop for now. And Mark, maybe there'll be some questions to answer.
Thank you both. That was terrific to hear you both converse. And I mean, there is already a question or two in the chat, which I will maybe start with, and then I would ask those who have questions to just use the raise hand function, and then we'll try to call on you as we can. So I see a question from Bruce McIntyre, which is. Does one note different levels of inspiration, in quotes, in Mozart's performativity when Daines Barrington examined Mozart's abilities in 1764-65 London? Whether the boy could extemporize an aria in Manzuoli's manner depended, according to Leopold, on whether the boy was musically inspired. So, what's the role of inspiration, or are there different levels of inspiration in Mozart's performativity?
Well, I mean, one basic way to think about this is that he was inspired by market forces at the time. As I said earlier, there was a demand for, genuine improvisation, and that alone was surely enough to give some inspiration for what he was trying to do. And the same thing, we can see similar trends in the development of operatic characters, that there, especially in the late 18th century, there was a demand for characters who were individuals, who would not be confused for other characters as sort of generic types. Um, I guess I would answer the question from that angle, saying that Mozart, I think, was often inspired by his acute sense of the market needs around him. He was, for much of his career, a freelancer who had to be sensitive in this way to make money. I'm um, I'm riffing on the working stiff idea from Neil Zaslaw. Um, but I think that's a powerful powerful answer to this question.
You maybe grab that for me?
We could just ask
Yes.
everyone
Yeah.
to mute, please. That'd be great.
I don't know why short people are allowed to have organic notes, but apparently.
Thank you. Great. Thank you, Dorian. I was just, do we have other questions? I've got the gallery view up now, so I can sort of see everybody better.
He's asleep.
I think I see Matteo Magarotto has a question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. You mentioned K400, and I missed a couple of minutes at the beginning, sorry, in case that's relevant. But I think you're referring to that G minor passage in which two words are also inscribed on a couple of melodic shapes. As far as I know, is the only case of Mozart inscribing the name of Sophie and Constanze, or any names indeed on a. Did you make a sense of that from a performative type of? Did you think about that in any way?
No, I didn't. And incidentally, that's not the passage that I
That's
was
not the
thinking
one. Okay.
about. No, it's not. There's a different G minor passage in the exposition. It's not a. It's simply G minor as a predominant to the big cadence in F major as 5, where the piano figuration just happens to be the same exact 16th notes and left hand that he uses later in the 20th piano
Okay,
concerto, in the
misunderstood.
same place leading up to the F major cadence. I don't know of other cases of the Sophie Constanze type phenomenon, although of course there's the horn rondo where there are the little annotations poking fun at is it Joseph Leutgeb, the horn player, uh, uh, you know, about technical challenges that he won't be able to that he won't be able to bring off. So there are little, there are cases of Mozart writing playful notes in his music, and there are doodlings. But I don't talk about that in about either of those cases in the book.
The mystery remains open.
Yes, indeed.
I might take an opportunity to ask a question, Dorian, which I found this discussion about modularity very interesting. Of course, it's such an important part of the direction in which music theory related to this period has gone in the past 20, 30 years. Um, I sort of wondered whether, as a performer, you could kind of speak from this point of view for a minute. Um, what do you think the implications of modular thinking are on performance, and maybe from a point of view of a pedagogue, somebody teaching somebody to perform? Um, because so much of how performance has historically been conceptualized has to do with um, our
Long
sort of
lines.
long-term manner of
Yes.
thinking about things. And how does this modular approach affect, does it lead to a kind of more in the moment approach to playing? Or would you kind of see it as a marriage between that and a more some kind of retaining some sense of overall coherence or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and actually, in some sense, it's the question that caused the book to happen. The book was essentially written because I've been performing Mozart for a long time, and I've always struggled to figure out exactly how to capture the character changes, to bring out the expressive modules, especially. One of the questions that I have asked for a long time, and the book doesn't resolve this by any means, but one question is, how often are we looking for modular changes, especially on the expressive level? It's easy to say when a Romanesca ends. It's easy to label the beginning of that fonte or the end of it, but to figure out exactly where one voice in some imagined dialogue in a violin sonata starts or ends can be much harder. And this includes labeling topics. It can be hard. It's easy sometimes to label topics, but actually, it's amazing how up for grabs even topical labeling still is.
Yeah.
You read multiple theorists on the same passage, they can come up with bewilderingly different labels for various passages. All of this is to say, I've been asking these questions about performing Mozart for much longer than I've been thinking about this from a scholarly perspective. And uh, my answer, personally, I mean, a lot of this comes down to taste. How restless do you like your Mozart? I like my Mozart as restless as possible. So indeed, when I am performing Mozart, I attempt to think not at all about coherence or long range planning, and simply do the most exaggerated, not comical, I hope, not cartoonish, but exaggerated moment by moment shifts that I possibly can. Um, it's, that's at least at this point in my life, that's the ideal. I'm sure this will change. You mentioned the idea of long phrases, and I think in some sense that's a different thing, because the long phrases often, when I think of my early teachers telling me to sing out long phrases, they weren't really thinking about changes of character or trying to hamper changes of character. They were trying to just get one bar to the next, even within a particular character or phrase, just trying to get one bar to sustain into the next. And uh, I think of this as being a somewhat different thing, that we can find performances where on the sort of micro level, we get a lot of sustain and vocal qualities, but still on the macro level, we get a sort of madcap variety of expressive states. Anyway, that's yeah, I'm glad you asked. This is something that I try to pursue when I perform Mozart, and my relationship with all this, of course, changes quite a bit. But that's in general, I'm not looking for extended expressive playing. I'm looking for just the most vivid individual phrases I possibly can have.
Yeah, just to say, I agree. It's an important point that these modules are not watertight things. It's very certainly the case with topics, but actually also the case for schemata, because I've read plenty of stuff where a writer says, "Here's this schema," and I just disagree, or they are defining it purely in melodic terms, whereas for me, a schema has to be has a two-part basis, right? It's a particular melody and a particular kind of bass line. So in other words, we can agree that modularity is a kind of governing syntactical concept, but it's not like the individual bits, interlocking bits, we're necessarily going to agree on what they are.
Absolutely.
Great. I see a couple of other hands up. I think Michael Ruling's hand first.
I put it back down because the answer to the last question kind of answered my question. I do have another question, but let Neil go first, please.
Okay, Neil, go ahead.
Okay. A certain feature of the book hasn't been mentioned, which surprises me, which is that the chapters are variations. They're not chapters, or at least that's the rhetorical move that you've made. And I wonder if you could reveal in what sense you wanted that us to understand the book.
Yes. I mean, it was partly just a sort of literary idea. I on some level, I don't have an interesting answer to this. Given that variation is so central to Mozart, both as a composer and as a performer, it seemed like a nice way to organize it. But it also, so the book tries to essentially have two large-scale agendas. One of them we've talked about, and it's this move from modularity to longer range considerations of character and persona. In another sense, though, and in that sense, there's a sort of a telos from the first variation, as it were, until the last. In another sense, the chapters are all trying to look at a different aspect of Mozart's persona, and all try to coexist at the same time in some way. The chapters talk to each other quite a lot. I come back to various examples across the chapters, and in that sense, the chapters are variations of each other. And as I say, I don't, beyond that, I don't have, I think, a very groundbreaking answer. It's mostly an organizational conceit that I thought just played well with the.
In the course of listening to the dialogue, which was fascinating, you had to say, well, I already in chapter so-and-so got this feature going, or I'll deal with that in a later chapter. So it sounded like there was some accumulative notion that you wanted to point out.
Absolutely. Yeah. And sorry.
I think you're being too modest, is what I'm saying.
Variation sets do have that cumulative sense of they also have a sort of stasis. They just move around the same theme and look at it from different angles, but they also tend to go somewhere. And I was trying to play with that. And then with the idea of an embellished reprise for the last, the sort of coda that embellishes the introductory theme.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Other questions? I see Ana Sanchez Rojo.
Hi. I was thinking a lot about the intersection of the concept of modularity and subjectivity that you mentioned. And you directed it towards the operas. And according to the conversation early on, where this modularity relies on the conventions or expectations and how you use those or subvert or reaccommodate those conventions. I wanted to ask you if you think this modular type of composition or performance implies a different balance in the agency of the performer and composer and the audience than maybe the one we think about, the way we think about it today. In other words, because this would only like you said, show the intricacy or the interest of the piece based on how it's playing with these expectations, does the audience have a different level of agency? And do you think Mozart, by kind of creating this, what you call restless music, was shifting this balance and maybe like calling more attention to his own compositional or performative persona?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly my sense is that the answer to the last question is yes. I think that Mozart was indeed calling attention to all this, and especially when you see him do the hijinks he does in his very public music, the symphonies and the large serenades. I think it's unquestionably true that he knows that he's playing with the audience, and I love the idea that the audience is therefore, that there's a changing dynamic between the performers, the composer, and the audience, that the audience is somehow present. Absolutely. I mean, Mozart certainly has a psychological model of the audience in some abstract sense in his mind as he's writing things. So I think the audience is indeed somehow contained, or sorry, I should say Mozart's conception of the audience is indeed somehow contained in the musical works. And that's something that convention surely makes possible. The more conventionalized the style is, the more Mozart has some sort of sense of what people expect at any given moment. And so actually, to some extent, the idea of conventions is the bedrock on which all of this rests. One thing I would just say, though, maybe a slightly different take on the modularity. It's true that many of the modules are conventional, but I think one of the important ideas about modularity is that it can operate at multiple different levels of reduction or abstraction. So you can have, modularity can apply to anything that can be schematized and chunked, as psychologists would say. Anything that can be recognized as some kind of coherent unit at any level of abstraction or reduction can be a module. And what this means is that, for example, sticking with schemata, the Romanesca is a module, the Printer is a module, but then at a higher level of abstraction, the Romanesca-Printer combination is also a module that can feature in unfolding phrases. And in the same way, various themes in a sonata form movement are modular, but also the sonata form movement itself, sonata form, is also a module that can feature in symphonies or in sonatas or in opera numbers. And I think that's also important because it means that Mozart is not only dealing with expectations at some very reduced level, he's dealing with expectations at a much more abstract level often, that still rely on the logic of modularity. But I think we shouldn't equate modularity too much with convention, because sometimes these modules, again, expressive devices, things that can be chunked that aren't conventional, are still modules, and they're still operating as these kind of recognizable, chunkable, and then very changeable units.
This question might be for Dorian and Dean, real quick. I just was sort of thinking over this idea of the persona that you talked about a little bit, and obviously that has like cone-esque resonances. And also, Ed Klorman has been writing stuff in this vein, which talks about, his book on the music of friends, and also relating to stuff that Dean has written, which has to do with sociability and the interplay of voices, such as, Dean, your piece on the gracious riposte in the Beethoven volume and stuff like that, where, so are we all talking about the same thing here in different ways, or do you view your version of that as kind of an iteration or as a parallel with these other kind of theories or modes of developing this idea of persona? And maybe Dean, you could jump in on that question as well.
Dean, do you want to go first, or?
Actually, what I wanted to was really just wanted to start with the postscript to what Dorian was saying about modules as conventions, and just make the point, which I've certainly made in print, that we should not assume that conventions are bad things. That conventions become conventions because they serve a purpose. In life, just as in art. And of course, we're so trained on this idea that you have to get beyond conventions. And of course, then there's also the argument that if you do subvert or get beyond a convention, you're actually reinforcing its power because perceptually it serves as a point of departure, right? So I just wanted to make those basic points because, in other words, we don't need, if we think we need to rescue modules, because they're conventions, I think that's the we should question that sort of very, very basic thing, right? Because we're so trained on music becomes better where it departs from established models.
Yeah,
Right.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah. Just to briefly address the other portion of Mark's point about the persona. Absolutely. Yes, a lot of my thinking on the composer's persona comes from Cohn. And then to some extent from writers who are building on Cohn. I don't see what I'm doing as replacing or challenging any of that. I think that the main thing about persona here is that I'm offering a different view of what Mozart's persona might be, and of course I differ from Cohn on some of the particulars. Likewise with Thorman and with Ed's work and with Dean's work, I often use their analyses, and I'm thinking, for example, Dean's wonderful analysis of the first movement of K.499, the D major quartet in his sociability book, features in my Mozart book, and not as a way of replacing them, but to point out the extent to which these other authors are hearing Mozart as being playful and restless. And in the case of the K499 analysis, one of Dean's points is that Mozart manages improbably to delay a final cadence far more than you think he possibly can. And this is an example I want to say of playing dumb, of acting like he doesn't know how to close the exposition. And so there's just always one more 2-bar unit, one more 2-bar unit, and then finally the thing ends, and you heave this sigh of relief. The piece is finally ended. None of this is incompatible with what other writers on Mozart are doing. It's just it's a way of sort of organizing it all. And same thing with the modules. As I said at the start today, topics haven't explicitly been seen as being just as modular as the schemata figures. And one of my ideas is that in fact, on some level, we're really just talking about the same phenomenon, just a different level of expressive abstraction.
Okay, thanks.
I just think the crucial point that Dorian makes in the book is, yes, a compositional persona, but it's a performative one, and that's a bit distinctive. So I take that a performative persona is a kind of a way of saying to the audience, I am a composer, and that's not the kind of persona I would hear in a lot of other work from earlier and later periods.
Mm-hmm.
So just that whole kind of performativity tied up with music as a language.
Mm-hmm. Right. Great. I think Neil has his hand up.
Yes. Thanks, Mark. What you've been saying in the last 15 minutes, Dorian, is illustrated by something that everybody knows about. So this is nothing new. The letter that Mozart wrote from Paris about the Paris Symphony, which is an extraordinary letter. And when he says, well, since all the symphonies here begin tutti, I began with just 2 violins. And then when the orchestra came in, the audience, they were surprised and they clapped. He's tickled that the audience is listening and it gets his playful aspect. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I have a reading of the letter at 2 points in the book. Again, variation returns. I talk about the letter in the 1st and 5th chapters, and I think that the people who have used the letter before don't go quite far enough with the implications. I think it's interesting to see where Mozart is accurate in his judgment of other symphonies. For example, he's wrong about the piano beginning of last movements. He says that the first and last movements begin forte and tutti, and if you look at symphonies that are being performed at the same time in Paris, it's false. But more interesting are the ways he understates his own compositional ingenuity, and I go into detail on this in the 5th chapter in the last movement of the symphony. He talks about the piano forte thing, but actually the instability of the opening piano is really striking. The syncopations, if you're not listening carefully, with the syncopations in the first violins, you have no idea where the downbeat is. So when the forte comes, it's probably on. It sounds like it's on the wrong beat. and then it's a 3 bar phrase when it does come and it lands on a wrong note the third time he brings it back. There are all these things he doesn't mention that are much funnier than the things he does, and I find it interesting that uh, that he's thinking in this way, but he doesn't spell it out in even as much detail as he could to his father.
Great. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. Jessica.
I'm sort of returning to Neil's first question about the variation theme because um, I was very struck by that aspect of the book. And one of the things that I found really effective about your book was the way in which the variation theme draws out the aspect of performativity in each one of the chapters. And so Neil made that point in a couple of different ways, and I think it helps to address, and you do this in so many different ways, but it helps to address something about the classical style so we have a whole Zoom room full of people who are fans of the classical style, but sometimes the classical style gets a bad rap as being predictable or repeatable. But by framing it the way that you frame it, and by bringing Mozart the Performer to the fore in studying Mozart's compositional process, it seems to me that what you're doing is explaining how the music surprises us continually because it's always sounding as if it's coming into being. And I wondered if you wanted to say, and that seemed to me to be motivating a lot of the book, and I wondered if you wanted to just say something about it that seemed to me to be one of the variations.
Yeah, thank you. Incidentally, I'm so touched by the generosity of your reading. That's it's really wonderful. Yeah, I mean that's in some sense that is also the goal of the book, and this actually gets back to the question Mark had also asked about my own identity as a performer of this music. One of the things I talk about this at the very end in the very short section on performing Mozart. One of the things I'm trying to do in the book and also in my life as a performer is, uh, you know, suspend disbelief and try to pretend that I am in fact encountering the music for the first time and use this little mental fiction as a way to try to find a new path through the piece, to actually try to ask, even though I've heard each of these pieces, I've heard them many times. I'm not hearing anything for the first time really, and yet to try to ask, if I were, what would it be like at this particular bar of this particular sonata? What do I really think is coming in the next beat? And to try to build an interpretation around that to really maximize that. This often highlights the modular incongruities, right? This often is a way suspense is most keenly felt when something is coming to an end and you're wondering what's going to come next. But this is something that I try to do across the book, indeed, and this is where a lot of the analyses come from. They're in some sense they're very much blow by blow analyses, and the reason for that is precisely that I'm trying to construct a way of hearing this music as if for the first time. And of course, this is just one possible approach. I'm sure many people who want to hear the music as if for the first time might come up with different kinds of explanations for how the music is unfolding. But indeed, that's absolutely the aim of the analyses and also of my work as a Mozart performer, is to try to find those places where I can suspend that disbelief, imagine that I'm encountering it as if it's really unfolding and I have no idea what's coming next, and thus, be shocked or amazed or transported or beguiled by the thing that Mozart does end up doing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Maybe one more question. I don't know if I should throw this out in the last few minutes, but I wanted to just be provocative and say, is Mozart actually is Mozart distinctly restless, or is he just is restlessness characteristic of this whole period? Because if you look at a composer like Scarlatti or something, I mean Scarlatti's restless too, right? Haydn can be
For
restless.
sure.
So is Mozart's restlessness different from what we would think of as the galant kind of general tendency toward shifts of texture and topic and all that stuff?
Yeah, it's a wonderful, wonderful last question. And I'm glad to have a chance to muse about it for a moment. I think that there is a difference. This also gets back to something Dean was hinting at before, but we didn't really talk about. I think there is a difference between Mozart as a restless composer and other restless composers at the time. And it's something that I venture in the book. As this is something that very much comes from intuition. I can't say for sure that other composers are not doing it, but I think that one of the things that makes Mozart Mozart in this respect is that there's an ambiguity about the sort of nature of the restlessness. All these composers are restless. You're right. I see that Matteo has put in the chat CP Bach is a great example. They're all restless. But I think with Mozart, one of the fun things is that uh, one doesn't always know, or one rarely really knows for sure what the point of the restlessness is or how the restlessness is working. And I think that's very different from a lot of these other composers. Um, my personal sense, I love Beethoven's music. For example, I think of Beethoven as doing a lot of the things that we've talked about today, but Beethoven isn't ambiguous about the emotional games he's playing with you. I think when Beethoven is being funny, when he's being restless and funny, you know it. He will go to great lengths to make sure that you laugh. And I think with Haydn also, there's a sense that he when he is being funny often, and he knows that and with Mozart, I think one of the things that comes through for me is that I'm constantly wondering, as I hear my way through a piece, I'm constantly wondering to myself, like, did he really do that? Is that actually important and funny? Is he really being restless here, or is this a continuation of something and it's actually quite, beautiful in the 18th century sense? And I find that to be, again, for me as a listener, as a player, as an interpreter of this music broadly speaking, I find that to be the thing about Mozart that distinguishes him from the other restless musicians at the time, that there's really an ambiguity about it. And I try to talk about that in the book, but again, that's something that doesn't come through as much as I think some of the other technical things we've been talking about. It comes through at the very beginning and then the very end. But that's, for me, that's really where it's at.
Well, I think
It's
that's a very
the
compelling
ambiguity of it.
explanation. I mean, Dean, do you want to talk about that real quick before we sign off here?
Well, I'd need to think about that a bit more because I think the ambivalence is kind of built in. Yeah, I mean, a Dorian's conceding that anyway, that if you have this style full of disparate materials moving from one thing to another, then, in a sense, there's no home territory. And so ambivalence is kind of built in almost as a technical feature. But we're talking about you're sort of moving towards what you'd call emotional climate of the music, I guess.
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's equally there in other composers, but it's expressed differently. But I kind of think you're onto something that, yeah, with Mozartian ambivalence, things just keep on going on. He doesn't necessarily point to them, yeah, point to things in quite the same kind of way. And I think that's related to this whole thing we were talking about with, like his great retransition technique, where, he does all this crazy stuff, but actually in the end,
Yeah.
it's kind of smooth,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
You know what I
Like
mean?
something
So
like
it's
yeah,
somehow I think what you're
yeah,
getting at, relates to that. Um,
yeah.
that there's a kind of pride that he wants to do all sorts of crazy and amazing things, but he also wants to show that he can make things work.
Which you feel
Yeah.
somehow that,
Ultimately, the thing he wants things to be heard as working.
but in contrast to somebody like Scarlatti or C.P. Bach, who sometimes feel quite jagged in terms of their
Yes, that's the
right.
point.
Yeah,
That's the point.
and not to say that they lack unity or whatever that means, but Mozart makes it a point of then kind of bringing things together in a sort of, yeah, in a differently satisfying way, let's say. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's often the sheer sonic pleasure of it in Mozart that
Mhm.
also, as with all great art, you could listen to it on so many levels, and it's possible to listen to some of the retransitions, as you know, Dean mentioned the retransitions. You listen to some of them, and it's possible to ignore the fact that he might be being funny. Um, I get to the end of the retransition in the slow movement of the 25th Piano Concerto, and I still have no idea if it's funny or not. And there's a part of me that thinks that must be funny somehow, I think, and another part of me that thinks it's just beautiful in 18th century and 21st century senses.
Well, of course, there's plenty of humor in this style of music, which is not meant to prompt a specific reaction, because that's more thinking of the humorous end. But then you've got the ironic end. And so the whole point of that is you raise your eyebrow, you don't laugh.
Yeah.
We have a couple of other hands raised, but unfortunately, I think we need to wrap up because it is 6:28. So we will have to just reserve those for a future encounter. As we do wrap up today, I just wanted to share that the next event in the Encounter series will be analyzing opera seria. It's going to happen on Friday, March 7th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Again, if you've enjoyed this afternoon and you want to support the Encounter series, we'd encourage you to join one or more of the sponsoring societies if you're not already a member. And once again, could we just thank our speakers for a really wonderful conversation? Thank you both. I appreciate it very much. And thanks to you all for attending. And we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you all. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Jessica, Dean.
Thanks to everybody. Yeah.